Bueno, primero que nada agradecer la invitación a este evento y a Amy por acompañarnos aquí en este conversatorio en nuestro campus interdisciplinario. A ver, yo formularía las preguntas en castellano tratando de modular decentemente y Amy puedes contestar a lo mejor algo en castellano o si prefieres switch to English o inglés o francés. Posiblemente el inglés sea más comprendido por los auditores que el francés.
Mi español más o menos, ¿no?
Pero es bastante bueno. Entonces, como quiera.
Gracias. Okay. ¿En inglés? Okay.
¿Está bien si en inglés la respuesta? ¿Sí? ¿Todo bien? ¿Objeción ninguna? Perfecto, vamos con eso.
Podemos traducir un poco de
Y yo traduzco entonces un poco el inglés.
Gracias.
Bueno, entonces, como decía, gracias de nuevo por compartir este evento con nosotros. Y yo tenía una primera pregunta, habiendo sido compañera de Francisco todos estos años, largos años, ¿cómo veías tú su trayectoria cognitiva, incluyendo también lo afectivo? ¿En qué medida, la pregunta, en qué medida la puedes ver como un random walk, como un paseo al azar con chance encounters, con encuentros fortuitos que fueron marcantes, o como una trayectoria que va hacia un objetivo?
Los dos.
Quizás ambos, sí.
Ambos, ¿no? So, Francisco was a wanderer. Sometimes he wandered, errante. So sometimes I think a good metaphor to describe what the answer to the question you're asking is that Francisco was a kind of a sponge, and so he would meet people and he would collaborate. As you probably all know, many of his papers were written in collaboration. Very few things he wrote alone. Even this book, which he published alone, and I'll take a moment to do a publicidad for the re-edition of Principles of Biological Autonomy. But all the work in this was work that he did in collaboration. He was attracted to people in all domains, as you remember probably, Jorge, art, science, philosophy, spirituality. And so he brought people in, but at the same time, so kind of random, but at the same time, he was very directed and very intransigent about certain ways of thinking. Sometimes people found him a little tough, but this was because he had a trajectory, and you tell me, Jorge, if you agree with me or not. He had a very clear idea in the randomness of where he wanted to go, and that was towards a science of lived experience.
Quizás voy a recapitular un poco.
Sí, gracias.
Amy decía, Amy decía que en realidad ambos hay una componente de aleatoriedad, como ser errante, y al mismo tiempo tenía Francisco una visión muy clara de a dónde apuntaba. Y efectivamente interactuó con mucha gente y estaba abierto a interactuar en muchas direcciones, un espectro muy amplio. Y incluso algunos hallaban, junto con ese carácter aleatorio de la exploración, que podía ser como muy, incluso intransigente en la dirección y en la calidad de lo que apuntaba. Eso. Este es un aspecto, sí, yes, there's something more you want to say?
Pensó en otra mini historia. Por ejemplo, we went to hear a concert of Bach, a requiem. I think it was when we were dating, and at one moment during the intermission, he came out and we were talking, and he said, there was a moment when I was listening to that music when I felt my mind change. So even when he was listening to music, or he was always thinking about how his mind was working and transforming and interacting, and in this case with the music. So it was interesting to see him always, when he would see a movie or go to a concert or have an experience in conversation with someone, how he was always very conscious of su autotransformación a través de las experiencias.
Muy consciente o enfocado en cómo funcionaba su mente.
Sí.
Y en las experiencias, en las interacciones, en el mundo.
Sí.
Ahora, una pregunta relacionada en su exploración personal está su práctica del budismo. ¿Cómo veías tú su experiencia en el budismo y su vida científica? ¿Como trayectorias paralelas o en alguna medida integradas?
Totalmente integradas. Esta noche, esta tarde, voy a hablar un poco de eso, de la integración del budismo en su trabajo científico. So what I can say now is that Francisco did not hesitate to say that after the coup d'etat in Chile in 1973, he was in a state of, it undid him. He was a mess, we would say in American English, and so were many other people. And when he left Chile after the coup d'etat, about 9 months or so after the coup d'etat, 8 months after the September 11th, his dream was destroyed because, as many of you perhaps know, his dream was to come back to Chile after doing his doctorate at Harvard and to work with Chilean scientists in order to build a certain kind of science, in a new kind of science in Chile, and develop the science that had already started to exist. And so this dream was shattered. There was no way that he could continue after that, after the experience. So he left and went into a depression. And when he started to move, when he moved to the United States and got a job, he met a teacher, a Buddhist teacher. It was the 70s, so there were hippies everywhere still, and there were Buddhist teachers everywhere. And he met a Buddhist teacher whose name was Chogyam Trungpa, and he used to tell this story because he was in a very nervous state with this very active mind, and he said to the teacher, "What should I do?" And the teacher said, "How about trying for a little while, do nothing?" And he was his reaction was, I never thought about what it meant to do nothing. I'm always doing something. And so he stopped and started to meditate and realized that there were all sorts of things that were going on in his mind that he was completely disconnected to when he was focused on big plans, like building science in Chile or ambitions, this sort of thing. So in that sense, it was inaugural. Meditation was really inaugural for him.
Sí, Amy recapitulaba que todo el proyecto que tenía de construir una nueva ciencia, Francisco, debido al golpe de Estado cuando tuvo que abandonar Chile, eso quedó destruido. Y para él fue una circunstancia de depresión, el fracaso de este proyecto. Y cuando llegó a Estados Unidos se encontró con Trump, con el ama tibetano, y él le preguntó ¿qué puedo hacer? ¿Qué hago tal como me siento? Muy mal. Y Trump le dijo, no hagas nada. Cosa que lo dejó bastante perplejo, y a partir de esa respuesta sorprendente empezó a meditar, a darse cuenta de todo lo que pasaba en su mente, que estaba proyectado hacia los problemas y lo que había querido hacer, etc.
So there's another point that probably somebody should write something about in terms of Francisco and this question of meditation. Because in my experience of Francisco, so I met Francisco in 1985, so it was already much later. But what he said all the time was that for him meditation was like un herramienta para hacer fenomenología. It was a tool for doing phenomenology. And he also said, if it works better for you to use philosophical phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, Heidegger, use philosophical phenomenology, but what works for me is meditation, a different kind of phenomenology. There were problems with philosophical phenomenology, and there are problems with philosophical phenomenology because they don't provide practices. Husserl didn't give an empirical account of how to sit down and do epoche, for example. And so meditation was a way of putting into a real embodied practice phenomenology. But I just want to make the point that, and it's even a socio-political point, because when Francisco came to France, came to Europe, if you wrote a scientific paper and said that you were a meditator, it wouldn't get published. It was simple. You couldn't talk about Buddhism in the 1980s, and even in the 1990s, you couldn't talk about Buddhism and science and get published. So there's the side of looking for a practice, how to practice the mind, and there's also the side of the times, about what's acceptable during the times. And it wasn't until the early 2000s, after Francisco's death, a little bit before, embodied mind, the cuerpo presente, was the first moment when Francisco said, I'm going to throw some Buddhism in there and see what happens. But it was very difficult to be a Buddhist practitioner and a scientist at the same time, and now we're very used to it. But it was very different at the time.
Sí, Amy estaba evocando la dificultad que había en los años 80 y 90 en simultáneamente declararse un meditador o un practicante budista y un científico. Si se decía eso en un paper, seguro que no era publicado. Y él había desarrollado un interés grande en la fenomenología, que veía como una disciplina que no estaba enraizada en la práctica y en la experiencia en primera persona. Maybe I should try to translate after short periods.
Okay.
So you stop a bit and then translate.
Parece que igual todo entiende mucho. Sí. Sí, no es necesario.
¿Entiende?
Sí.
Sí.
Okay.
Eso me ayuda a escucharte.
Bueno, eso era sobre la integración y la influencia de la práctica budista en la labor científica. Otra pregunta, bueno, justamente en relación con la fenomenología, algo que interesa a bastante gente en Chile es lo que se llama actualmente microfenomenología o las técnicas en primera persona, que surgió un poco en relación con la entrevista de explicitación, de experiencias vividas por el sujeto. Y justamente había mucha desvalorización de la experiencia en primera persona como algo subjetivo. ¿Cómo ves tú el trabajo y los aportes de Francisco en el área de la microfenomenología y la experiencia en primera persona?
Well, the experience with Buddhist meditation was one of the elements that convinced Francisco that third-person studies in neuroscience were fatally limited. But I think you all know that. I mean, I think you all know enough about Francisco's work to know that he understood the importance of what he called objective science, so third-person science. The object is there, the brain is in the machine, or you're looking at, various different types of cerebral imagery. But what bothered him all the time, and this really started, if we wanted to get very historical about it, it started with autopoiesis and autonomy, but what really bothered him was the exclusion of first-person experience when you're studying the brain. You might say it's okay to use third-person techniques if you're studying the brain, if you think that the mind is in the brain. But as you probably all know, Francisco did not believe that the mind was in the brain, and what interested him was the mind. So he had the experience of a very strong trauma, first-person experience, looking at mind, learning how to look at mind through Buddhist meditation. Before the Golpe, when he was young, he'd already studied some phenomenology. He'd studied his William James, as probably a lot of you have studied your William James. He was interested in all the techniques of introspection. He was also very aware, as Jorge said, that all of those techniques of introspection were discredited by mainstream objective third-person science. But he was utterly convinced that we would never get to any understanding of the mind without having, he used to say this, you need to have the picture in 3 dimensions, first, second, and third. So there was no way to get a picture of the mind without adding first and second to third, to have the 3 dimensions. So I haven't answered about microphenomenology yet, but microphenomenology was one of the techniques that he started working when he was working with a doctoral student named Claire Petit-Mangin, a French student who developed the explicitation interview. But that's one of the techniques. Another technique is meditation. And another technique is Husserlian epoché, seen through the eyes of his colleagues Pierre Vermersch and Nathalie Deprat, in a book that they wrote called On Becoming Aware, where they tried to turn Husserlian epoche into a practice, something that can be understood as a practice, not just a theoretical structure. Now at Mind and Life Europe, which is the organization that I run, where we're working with Francisco's work and with the lineage of Francisco's work since his death, there are many other first-person techniques that are beginning to be developed and that are worth having a look at. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it, but we have a real very lively organization where people are developing other first-person techniques in order to develop better experiential accounts of human experience.
Sí, Amy enfatizaba que hay diversas técnicas de trabajo en primera persona y apuntando a la comprensión de la mente, y Pancho nunca adhirió a la idea que la mente está en el cerebro. Y entonces la microfenomenología o la técnica de entrevista y explicitación es una de ellas, también la meditación es otra técnica importante. Y otras más, sí. Eso. Ahora, algo que quizás interesa a bastantes personas, ¿cómo ves tú la labor que han desarrollado en Mind and Life Europe, el proyecto de Mind and Life pensando en el futuro?
El futuro. At Mind and Life Europe, what we started actually, so I don't know if many of you know or are interested in Mind and Life. It started in 1987, founded by Francisco with the Dalai Lama. They met in a meeting in 1983 in Alpbach with Dalai Lama, but this was before the Nobel Prize, so he could go places and talk to scientists without having a crowd around him. And there was David Bohm who was there. There were several other scientists who were there. And Francisco and the Dalai Lama just, I don't know if you know this expression, they hit it off. And so Dalai Lama said to Francisco, why don't you come up to Dharamsala and teach me some science? I know about biology because physics, because I've studied some physics. I continue to study physics, but I don't know anything about biology, and I don't know anything about the biology of the brain. And so they started to meet. So Francisco said, I'll come up to Dharamsala and teach you, but I won't come alone. I'll come and bring friends. And so in the first meetings in 1987 and in 1989, he mainly brought scientists who were also meditators, secret meditators, because you weren't allowed to say you were a meditator then. And then you can see this in one of the films, because the first meeting is filmed. Francisco says, we're going to call this organization Mind and Life, and in the morning he's talking to His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and he says, in the morning, we'll teach you normal science, and then we'll put on the hat of the normal scientist, and then in the afternoon, we'll be ourselves. Which meant doing non-traditional science and thinking about, and creating the dialogue with the Dalai Lama, who of course has many hours of first-person experience and meditation. And so that was how that started. And so when Francisco died, Mind and Life continued, mainly in the United States. And in 2006, the Dalai Lama said, I would like us to make a Mind and Life Europe. And so we created a new organization, so it's younger, we're younger, which is a good thing. Less of the past, the better. And we started with an idea that was very precise. Instead of a very large idea of just dialogue, Buddhism, and science, we decided to focus on Francisco's lineage. And not just Francisco, and more Francisco, but also what are people doing with this work today? So I invite you to look at our website, because we have many interesting scientists and scholars, some of the most well-known ones in enactive thinking. So Ezekiel de Paulo, Hannah de Jaeger, Evan Thompson, Rebecca Todd, I mean, a whole list of people who are working in what we call now the enactive lineage, but it's a large category, pushing these ideas forward. And one of our points of focus are development of first-person techniques and how to use the data or the information derived from these first-person techniques together with more experimental third-person data to continue to advance what Francisco called the neurophenomenology program. So we have a very precise mission. We also have, you're not going to be able to translate this all, but anyway, we also have a series called Art and Enaction. And one of the things that we realized was that when we talk to artists, musicians, painters, dancers, choreographers, curators, and we ask them to tell us what their process is, they told us in action. In other words, without knowing about the enactive theory of mind, they know it. So for us, that was proof of concept. And so now we're working very much in the arts as well, and also in the social sciences, around enlarging this concept of enaction and developing it for different areas of thinking, like the arts or the social sciences. You don't need to translate that, I think they understand.
Amy estaba evocando la interacción entre Francisco y el Dalai Lama y los encuentros famosos aquellos en Dharamsala y entre otras cosas que solían decir: en la mañana hacemos ciencia estándar, nos ponemos el sombrero del científico clásico, y en la tarde entonces podemos ser nosotros mismos. Y evocó también el trabajo importante interdisciplinario que se realiza en Mind and Life, y los invita a mirar el sitio de Mind and Life, donde colaboran diversos científicos de maneras muy transversales. En el linaje de Varela, podríamos decir, que en realidad es muy amplio, todos azimuts, en todas direcciones. Y también mencionó sobre la relación con artistas, arte y en acción, que en la práctica de muchos artistas aparece naturalmente la inacción, sin que ellos hayan aprendido sobre ella mediante exposiciones, pero a partir de la experiencia vivida. Ahora, hay ahí una relación interesante con lo interdisciplinario y lo transdisciplinario, que a lo mejor podrías comentar en ese trabajo, que va más allá de dar disciplinas.
Una diferencia que tú necesites explicarme.
Ajá. O en qué medida, bueno, tú habías dicho algo de crear una nueva ciencia. Es decir, no solo se trata de reunir distintas disciplinas, sino que uno va más allá de los dominios disciplinarios.
Hay vínculos subterráneos
Además,
entre disciplinas. Eso es trans.
Y algo emergente. Sí.
Sí, sí, sí.
Sí. Eso es ¿Y qué sientes tú que es quizás lo que quedó más pendiente como work in progress del programa de Francisco, lo que fue menos desarrollado y que ahora
creo que es la neurofenomenología. La neurofenomenología. But I'm tempted, so neurophenomenology and the question of, actually what I'm thinking is there's a beautiful book that was just written by Evan Thompson, who wrote De Cuerpo Presente with Francisco. And Evan wrote it with two other people, an astrophysicist named Adam Frank and a philosopher named Marcelo Glaser, and it's called The Blind Spot, El Punto Ciego. And it's a very important book because, and it's translated in Spanish, I think. Kairos Editorial Kairos, yeah. It's an extremely important book because they lay out the philosophical background of why it is fatal to not include lived experience in scientific accounts of human nature. And so, concretely, I think in terms of experimental programs, it's neurophenomenology that needs to be developed. And it needs to be developed with as many possible excellent first-person techniques as we can find. And sometimes the point I was trying to make earlier, sometimes we find those in the arts and not in the sciences. We definitely find them in philosophy. So neurophenomenology is very important because it's a program whose intention is to figure out ways to do really good science and account for lived experience. And open up the eye of the punto ciego. So more generally, I think the whole program of inaction, which is really a philosophical program, is another way of addressing the blind spot. Creating a biological theory of mind that includes philosophy and that includes, of course, Buddhist philosophy, because inaction, as it's laid out in De Cuerpo Presente, is anchored in Madhyamaka Buddhist philosophy, which means the philosophy of the middle path. So it's completely integrated into this book, De Cuerpo Presente, which is where inaction, the word inaction, is spoken for the first time. But I also think that the inactive program, as a scientifical, philosophical program, is our only hope if we want to change our epistemic vision, our epistemology of the way that we see the world. In other words, the problems that we have today, and I'm not going to get too bombastic, but the problems that we have today that are problems of ecology, and this is what I'll talk about tonight, problems of ecology, problems of polarization, confusion about what to do with things like AI that are coming really fast, and these problems cannot be looked at only with an old style epistemology of objectivity. disincarnate objectivity. And I think Francisco very early on had the intuition that that was not going to save the world, that epistemology, that science, and that the new science that he wanted to create, that he didn't create, but that we're trying to push along now at Mind and Life and with you, hopefully will be a science that will have the epistemological acuity to address problems that cannot be addressed with the old science. And so I think the key word for me is inaction, because it covers a real shift in the way you look at the world. And if you want to hear more, come tonight.
Sí, Amy insistía en el rol clave de la neurofenomenología y el aspecto experimental, una experimentación disciplinada, y cómo los problemas globales que enfrentamos difícilmente pueden ser acometidos con la epistemología antigua. Necesitamos una nueva epistemología, una nueva ciencia. Y evocó también la metáfora del blind spot, del punto ciego, que afecta a toda una cultura o toda una civilización. Y sí, quería
lo que es en el punto ciego es la experiencia vivida.
Y el rol clave de la experiencia vivida, que necesita estar integrada en la práctica científica. Por lo demás, a propósito de metáforas como la del punto ciego, ¿cómo ves tú el rol en el pensamiento de Francisco de la metáfora del Ouroboros, de la circularidad y la autorreferencia, también en el contexto experimental y relacional? Porque generalmente tendemos a pensar en
distancia entre objeto y sujeto.
No.
Sí, sí.
La circularidad parece que era un tema recurrente. ¿En qué medida?
Oui, la circularidad
No sé si querían comentar.
La metáfora del Ouroboros
que aparece en la cubierta de Máquinas y Seres Vivos, publicado el año 73.
Sí. It's a metaphor for circularity that is the form that follows Maturana and Varela's thinking. I think many of you know this, the question of self-reference, which both allowed Maturana and Varela and then beforehand to develop this notion of autopoiesis, which I'm sure you all know. But most of all, and I think this is the direction of Jorge's question, the bigger principle that is like the umbrella over autopoiesis, which is an example, is this question of autonomia. And the autonomia of all organisms, like in the autopoietic cell, means that there is a kind of a circular functioning. So you all know from Maturana the notion of organizational closure, I think. And so this circularity, you could talk for hours about this circularity, around and around. But the circularity, and I think this is where Jorge was pointing, is that shifts the figure of the subject distanced from the object, and it places the subject, sujeto y objeto, the subject and the object, in a completely different relationship than the objectivist epistemology. It's a question that you could take a lot of time answering on autoreference, and I'm not exactly sure where to go with it, Jorge.
Bueno, Amy estaba haciendo notar que, claro, el énfasis en la circularidad y la autorreferencia es un antídoto a la postura que mira el sujeto y el objeto, ¿ya? Un hiato entre ellos y una dirección.
Technically, this circularity, this notion of circularity and autoreferencia permits an identity to exist, and it permits a point of view. Right? Once you have a system that's closed, organizationally or operationally closed, you have Pablo or Claude or me. You have a unit that then has a perspective on the world. So the circularity is essential for the creation of individualidad biología. Es muy básico. Que permite una perspectiva y unas posibilidades de acción en la vida.
Sí, gracias. Y justamente ayer una colaboradora coreógrafa que está en Artes del Movimiento me hacía notar que Francisco usa la litografía de Escher, en que hay dos manos y cada una dibuja la otra. Draws the other into existence.
La recursividad.
Y que es como un aspecto importante en que hay un proceso, una creación, no solo turning around, pero esta, no sé, para ti es sugerente.
Mind and world create each other.
Mente y cuerpo se co-crean.
But without auto-reference and without circularity and without organizational closure, that can't happen.
Y eso no puede ocurrir sin circularidad. Y posiblemente durante mucho tiempo nuestra cultura ha tenido un blind spot, un punto ciego sobre la circularidad. ¿No?
La mandala.
Ajá. Está en las mandalas. Bueno, antes quizás de dejar tiempo para preguntas, no sé si hay algo más que querías evocar o en particular sobre a lo mejor la nueva edición.
So this book, I don't know if you know it, it's called Principles of Biological Autonomy. Francisco wrote this book it was published in 1979. So it was the work that he did between the time he left Chile and 1979. So it was after his leaving Maturana's lab and going to the United States and starting to work more or less on his own. It does contain, if you know the original 1979 version, you know that it contains a certain number of articles that he wrote with other collaborators. Many of them were in the science faculty in Chile, and We re-edited this book because you couldn't get it anymore. You couldn't find it anymore. And we re-edited it with a philosopher of cognitive science whose name is Ezequiel de Paulo, who's in the Basque country in Spain, and with Evan Thompson, who is a philosopher of science and cognitive science who wrote De Cuerpo Presente with Francisco. And what's very interesting, I think, about this re-edition, which is also available in the form of an e-book, is that De Paulo and Thompson wrote short prefaces talking about Francisco's writing at the time and what's been happening ever since. So in some ways they update it, and they also add notes, because a lot of this material is stuff that the younger people who are here contains material that you may know but only very vaguely, or you may not know. And they put in notes to explain some of the concepts historically. So it really their work really brings the book alive again. And what's interesting is when I reread it, I with their notes, I realized how actual Francisco's thinking in 1979 still is today. And I think that it's a very interesting experience if you're interested in Varela's work to look at this new edition.
Sí, Amy hacía notar que con la colaboración de Ezequiel Di Paolo y Evan Thompson, esto trae, por decir, a la vida de nuevo la obra de Francisco Varela de los años 79, por ahí, y los desarrollos posteriores, porque hay muchas notas escritas por ellos que son un update de lo que ha ocurrido después. Así que realmente es una obra señera que vale la pena mirar. Something else you would like to add or comment?
I'm interested if there are any questions. If I can't, I don't know. Maybe between Jorge and me, we can manage some questions, no? From the audience?
Hay entonces un llamado, hay preguntas en la audiencia que las pueden hacer en castellano o directamente en inglés o francés si quieren, por favor.
Hola, ¿se escucha? Hola Amy, gracias por tu presentación. Mi pregunta es bien concisa. Me gustaría saber, pensando en Francisco, si estuviera ahora con nosotros, o desde tu perspectiva, ¿qué crítica le harías a la psicología clínica actual? Desde la idea como que se mantienen desde la visión activista. No sé si se entiende la...
So you're asking me about a critique of clinical psychology?
Desde el activismo.
A critique of it from the point of view of an active thinking?
Sí.
How would you describe that critique?
Es que yo, como la idea que tengo de la psicología es un ejercicio, por decirlo así, como empírico, a través de la entrevista clínica, de lo que uno observa en la conducta y el relato del paciente, ajustarlo como a categorías diagnósticas. Y encuentro que eso es un poco reducido. No sé si estoy haciendo una buena descripción, pero creo que el activismo sería como, no sé si contrario, pero más amplio a esa visión.
Okay, I get it. Yeah. So first I should say that I'm a psychoanalyst,
Okay.
which is super different from what you're describing. But I understand the picture of clinical psychology and the question of the diagnosis. Without getting into too much detail, I can tell if you're interested, I don't know if you're interested in clinical psychology,
Un poco, sí.
but there's some very interesting work being done. There's a book written by a woman named Sanneke de Haan. She's a Dutch woman, an activist, called Enactive Psychiatry, which has an analysis of the question of the diagnosis and the question, all those questions from the perspective of enaction, and a whole discussion about how to create an active psychiatry. So it's called Enactive Psychiatry, the book, if anybody's interested. There's also a clinical psychologist named Thomas Fuchs, F-U-C-H-S, who's written a whole lot about what could be a phenomenological, enactive approach to mental illness, but I was about to say human suffering, because we're not talking about this mental illness or that mental illness, we're talking about human suffering, which is what we encounter when someone comes into our office. And Thomas Fuchs is also something of a historian of psychiatry, and he links the possibility of an enactive approach to clinical psychology with the existential phenomenologists of the 20s and 30s and 40s, like Binswanger. So there was a whole school of phenomenological existential psychologists, mainly in Germany, but also in France, in the 20s and 30s, who developed different techniques. Another one is Viktor Frankl, who wrote about his experience in Auschwitz. So there's a whole group of people who are working on to refine the kind of question you're asking. So in terms of, the caricature, the caricature of a clinical psychologist who looks objectively and makes a clinical portrait and then slams a diagnosis on it and then writes a prescription, that's a caricature. What concerns us really is how to make a conversation between existential psychology, phenomenological psychology, and even psychiatry, because this book, Enactive Psychiatry, does confront this problem in psychiatry of manic objectivity. How about putting it that way? Just like crazy objectivity. But there are a whole group of people who are trying to make the rapprochement, to bring together, using existential work and using enaction to create a new kind of conversation. I'm working on it with psychoanalytic techniques. For example, and this could be a very long conversation, but enaction has a lot to teach us about what it is to listen. What kind of mental activity is it to listen? What are we doing when we're listening? And so the more I study enactive ideas, the more I notice when I'm in my office with a patient, and what I do mainly is listen. I listen differently. And it changes the relationship that I have with the patient. So that may seem like a very small thing, but actually it's a very big thing when you're working with someone who's suffering. The question of the body is thematized by psychoanalysis in a particular way. It's thematized by enaction in a different way, but we can talk with each other. So we have a conversation, and that brings alive both theories. an active theory, psychoanalytic theory.
Gracias. Hola Amy. Hello.
Amy mencionó la obra, por ejemplo, sobre el activismo en psicología de Thomas Fuchs, F-U-C-H-S, como en alemán, y trabajo muy interesante realizado sobre psicología inactiva. Entonces hay todo un grupo de personas trabajando sobre ese tema. Thomas Fuchs es bastante común. Podemos compartir la referencia. Los otros autores eran Haneke con H y Saan, S-A-A-N. Psiquiatría en activa. Un campo interesante. Sí.
Hi Amy.
Hi.
How are you? So I was introduced to Francisco's work not long ago by my friend. I do not come from a science background. I am actually a cook, I'm a chef. And I've been pretty interested in spiritual practices through an exploration of consciousness through spiritual practices for the last maybe 5 years. I would like to ask, I'm kind of concerned how modern science captures spiritual practices, or if there's any space in modern science studies about those kind of things.
If there's any what?
If there's any like studies or concerns or interests in modern science about these kind of things.
About how science is grabbing spiritual practices and putting it in machines and looking at brains of meditators? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a problem.
Is it a problem?
Oh, it's a problem for I mean, okay, if I want to be a little bit more adult, I would say it was a phase that we needed to go through, and we went through it. You know, so there was this need to look at the brains of meditators and to see how they were different from the brains of non-meditators. And I may be exaggerating a little bit because there's certainly a certain number of neuroscientists out there who still are putting in, doing magnetic imagery of meditating brains, but many fewer, at least as far as I know. It was kind of inevitable in a way once, and it really started with Mind and Life, with Francisco and the Dalai Lama, that once you bring two, I'm going to try to say this, but it's very subtle, the idea of bringing together meditation and Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist embodied experience through people like the Dalai Lama was a very subtle idea. It was different traditions, science and Buddhism, different bodies, non-meditating bodies, meditating bodies. It was different life experiences, bringing them together into dialogue to see what would emerge from that dialogue. It was sort of inevitable, given the passion for objective science that we have in the West, that there would be scientists who would think, oh, you know, this person's been meditating, all you have to do is spend 5 minutes in the presence of the Dalai Lama, and you know you're in the presence of something different. It's an experience you have. I've had it. Everybody's had it that I know. But that doesn't make me necessarily want to put him into a machine and see where it's happening in his brain. But I can definitely understand how that was a kind of in French we would say a dérive. It was a, ¿cómo? Deriva. Una deriva of the beginning of the dialogues between the Dalai Lama and Francisco and other scientists. And it was una deriva that it seems to me is inevitable given the predominance of a certain epistemology in the West in terms of scientific studies. That was done from, I would say, the mid to late 90s up until the mid 2010, 11, 12, 13. But in my experience, there are fewer and fewer experiments like that, looking for the extraordinary result of meditation practice in the brain through scientific experimentation. I think we're getting a little bit less naive about it. But the big problem and the worst deriva in this story is that the dialogues were never meant to take meditation as an object or meditators as objects. The idea of the dialogue was to see what would happen when you put two voices and two bodies together, and what would come out of it is kind of an emergent process. Like when you're cooking something and you put in two ingredients, a third thing happens, right? So what was that third thing going to be? And that's very challenging to put your finger on that third thing, right?
I think it's interesting to address what we saw last night with the protocol and how it is capturing the essence of the native flavors and the native ingredients of the native.
Yeah, I will. But the problem is that particularly in the United States, but in many places, what people want is, they very quickly miss the idea of an emergent dialogue, and what they see is something that the other person has that they want. And the way they think that they can get it is by isolating where it is, and trying to figure out a way to put it in the form of a 6-week practice or a pill or whatever. And so, but what I'm trying to say, and I hope I'm answering your question, is that it was kind of there were a certain number of neuroscientific advances made through those studies in understanding how the brain works, but fundamentally, studying the brains of meditators was, I think, una deriva. And now we're coming back to understanding that it wasn't a question of pure meditation. The Dalai Lama brings a whole culture with him, he brings a whole philosophy with him, and we have to engage with all of that when we want to have a true dialogue. We can't just engage with a fantasized idea of what his neurons look like.
Makes sense.
And what Enrique was saying to me was that, but this is another conversation. We were at Rodolfo Guzman's restaurant last night.
Cool.
And so he was talking about the whole notion of flavors and savors and the invisible, and how you have to stay with the savor and the flavor and go deeper into it, and the deeper you go, the wider it goes, right? Something like that. You can talk.
Just to relate to what you were saying, is that it's quite interesting. Es muy interesante cómo el trabajo que están haciendo ahí también es de recuperación de unas técnicas que nos fueron transmitidas por tradición oral para poder traer ese conocimiento que también tiene una relación, por un lado, de la gastronomía con unas mezclas químicas, científicas, pero también con un sentido espiritual que tienes con la comida, ¿no? Entonces, súper interesante tu propia práctica y cómo puedes continuar justamente con esa práctica, porque en esa conexión con la metodología o las tecnologías de estos pueblos originarios también nos conectamos con estas propias prácticas de lo local. Y me imagino que ahí Claudia Vázquez también sería súper interesante que pudiera contar sobre el trabajo que hizo en ese sentido a propósito de esa relación entre arte y en acción.
Thank you so much.
Bien, disculpen, solo por el tema del tiempo, hay 2 palabras pedidas, vamos a unir ambas preguntas para la respuesta, ¿vale? Pour Amy, on va combiner les deux dernières questions pour finir l'activité parce que nous avons que quelques minutes. Ok?
¿Aló? Sí, perfecto. Voy a hacer mi pregunta en español. Dada la cantidad de años que estuvo con el profesor Varela, me gustaría saber qué es lo que entendía él por filosofía y por ciencia y la conexión entre estas 2 disciplinas. Debido a que el profesor Varela, como ustedes hablaron, tenía una perspectiva de interdisciplina y de transdisciplina. Y me gustaría saber cuál era su concepción de la filosofía y de la ciencia y si hay una yuxtaposición entre estas disciplinas. Esa es mi pregunta. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Sí. I want to say, necesitamos imaginar una vinagreta. La metáfora de hay aceite y hay vinagre, y cuando tú haces eso, trata de separar el aceite y el vinagre. ¿La vinagre? No se puede. Eso es mi impresión, mi idea primera. Fundamentally, and I said a lot of words here, fundamentally, I think philosophy for him was the absolutely necessary domain in order to, actually I'm going to start over. I think that if we wanted to be very romantic about Francisco, we could say, let's imagine a Renaissance man in a time before there were separations between philosophy and science and art. I don't know if you can imagine that person, hombre del Renacimiento, imagine a person who didn't even really think about those separations because they didn't exist. I don't think Francisco thought very much, oh, now I'm doing philosophy, oh, now I'm doing science. It was always something that was involved in what he was doing at the moment, and there was always a background, a trasfondo de todo. When he was in his laboratory, working with machines and working with sometimes animals, unfortunately, but he stopped doing that. There was a trasfondo of philosophy. So I think to think about, rather than think about, is Francisco more a philosopher or is he more a scientist, you have to try to imagine that there's no difference. and between the two things. So I think you have to do a bit of a thought experience. Does this make sense? Yeah. And Francisco also said once, and I'm not sure that he would say it today, but he said it in the 90s. He said it publicly. I think it's probably in one of these films that I gave Macarena. He said, I think you could throw out all technology from science and you'd have the best science. He said, science is pure thought. So in that sense, his idea was, how do I position myself to have my mind in the right place, to have the intuitions? It's not with technology, and it's not through, sometimes surprises happen with experimentation, but it's through what I'm holding in my mind. And so he actually said, the actual quote is, you could throw out all technology and science would still be there. Science is pure contemplation. So it's very difficult when you take someone like that who loved being in the lab, who loved building machines in the lab. He did a lot of engineering projects and he was very hands-on. He wasn't floating around in the air, you know, just thinking and writing books about thinking. You know, he was very concrete. And he actually writes about being concrete. And he says the only way we can live really is, he wrote a book, an article called The Re-Enchantment of the Concrete. But he just simply thought that you couldn't do science, that science was a contemplative practice. So before you start thinking which category he belongs in, try to imagine a time when there was no categories.
Thank you, Amy and Jorge, for this beautiful talk. In 1999, Francisco wrote a book chapter entitled Step to the Science of Intervening, Intersiendo en español. And Francisco proposed that the cognition as an intersubject, intersubjective affair, you know? A co-determination, me other or I other, and use the axioma, this mind is that mind. What do you think about that? And the and the effect in the society, you know?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. Well, we've talked a little bit about minds and worlds co-emerging, right? The idea of recursivity, the idea of autonomia, the idea of even autopoiesis, a single cell. When a single cell develops its membrane, it gives, with it emerges a world of meaning, right? The notion, this is a good question also because it allows me to introduce another concept that we are developing at Mind and Life Europe. This mind is that mind, so minds not only co-emerge, but they're co-implicated, so there are ethical resonances and ethical responsibilities involved with having a mind. Yeah? So that's a little bit of a path to go down if we wanted to go down it. This co-emergence and co-implication of minds, in the view of Francisco, of an action, has been developed by a group of brilliant people, including some Chilenos and some people from Brazil and other people from all over Europe, into a new application, if we can use that word, of an action for social groups called participatory sense-making. So when I was preparing my talk for tonight, I was thinking, how do I translate participatory sense-making? And I asked Ezekiel de Paulo. I wrote Ezekiel and said, how should I do this? And he said, I'd really like to say saber hacer, but that won't work. So you could say hacer saber, búsqueda de saber participativa. So es la idea que como persona necesito proteger mi autonomía, no mi autonomía en el sentido de autarquía, pero mi autonomía como alguien que está en contacto con nosotros siempre. Mi membrana es porosa, pero es cerrada también porque puedo existir. Y entonces, working with you, living with you, being with your mind, I have to maintain my autonomy, but I also have to be in constant contact, friction, relationship with a constantly changing environment. So I'm also constantly changing the nature of my autonomy at the same time. So mi mente es tu mente, and then after that, we have to participate together as two mentes, but that are separate, but always co-implied, co-implicada. Is that too abstract?
No.
No?
Okay.
Did I not Is it okay?
Bien, muchísimas gracias. Un gran aplauso a Amy, al profesor Jorge Soto, por acompañarnos el día de hoy. Esperamos que haya sido un espacio grato esta conversación para todos y todas. Y bueno, también los dejamos a todas quienes han podido participar el día de hoy con nosotros. Aquí a las 12 de la tarde se va a hacer la inauguración de una nueva exposición en la Plataforma Cultural, una exposición del Museo de Arte Popular Americano a las 12. Están cordialmente invitados todos y todas también. Muchísimas gracias, Amy, profesor Jorge Soto, por acompañarnos el día de hoy.